Good evening, everyone. My name's Laura Ginters, and I'm the Chair of Theatre and Performance Studies here at the University of Sydney. And first of all, it's my honour to introduce you to Yvonne Weldon, AM, who will welcome us to country. I'll just give you her bio before she comes out. Yvonne is an independent councillor and the first Aboriginal councillor in the City of Sydney's 180-year history. She was born and raised in inner Sydney, but maintains strong ties to her Wiradjuri homelands of Cowra and the Riverina areas of New South Wales. She follows in the footsteps of a proud tradition of activists and change makers, including her great aunt, Mum Shirl, and her uncle, Paul Coe, a prominent Aboriginal rights campaigner. Her family was instrumental in establishing the Aboriginal Children's Service, Aboriginal Medical Service, and the Aboriginal Legal Service in Redfern. Prior to her election to council, Yvonne held numerous senior positions in New South Wales government, non-government and Aboriginal-controlled organisations, working across health, human services, housing and child protection. She served as the elected chair of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, deputy chair of the New South Wales Australia Day Council, and as a board member of Domestic Violence New South Wales and Redfern Jardim College. In 2022, she was recognised as New South Wales Aboriginal Woman of the Year and appointed a member of the Order of Australia for her service to the Aboriginal community. She also published recently her debut novel, 67 Days, which was also shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards David Yunayapon Award. Please welcome Yvonne.
Thank you. I wish I was off so many of those boards. I still work full-time as well as doing council, so thank you so much for sharing. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra, here in New South Wales, from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee rivers. Unfortunately, where we're gathered, there aren't any people that have met legal requirements to be regarded as traditional owners of these lands. And so I am a representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are caretakers with culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you and the ancestors of the lands that you've travelled from or are from. My people's practices doesn't separate us. Our welcomes to countries in all its forms across this continent brings us together. And I just saw my brother that just walked in there. We're on the lands that has hundreds of nations, tribes and clans existing here for over 65,000 years. My people, this country's people, are the oldest continuously living culture of the world. We can and we do achieve so much more when we do so together. The Eora Nation's boundaries are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders and the members, I welcome everyone to the lands of the Gadigal. I acknowledge Gadigal people, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. Being here tonight and the sharing that's going to take place, it is important to remember of how the arts in all its mediums is our connection, the sharing of you, or even others that have gone before us, before all of us. For my people, it is important to keep our stories alive. We need to see them, we need to hear them, we need to be them, creating our joined history. We need to commence a healing and creating a future for all. The creativity shining through, enriching our souls, the emotions of the people, of the country, of the world around us, and also the world within. Let it be of the pulsation of care, love, and compassion for an all-inclusive future. All of us can make positive changes to each other now and into that future. To make it possible, let's all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, Ninyini, Nala, Wongan, Mari, Bajari, Gadi, Nurda, welcome to Gadigal land. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Yvonne, for that lovely welcome to country. Friends and colleagues, I'm delighted to see you all here as we gather for the 16th Rex Cramphorn Lecture this evening. Rex, as many of you know, was a brilliant theatre director, but also costume, lighting and set designer, theatre critic, theorist and translator. And he died far too young at the age of 50 in 1991. His friends and colleagues from the university and the wider profession set up the Rex Cramphorn Memorial Lecture in his honour, and the very first one was delivered in 1995 by legendary Australian director Jim Sharman. He was followed by other theatre artists, including John Romrell, Rhoda Roberts, Lindy Davies, Wesley Enoch, Neil Armfield and Geoffrey Rush in a double act, Nick Enright, Barry Kosky, Lyndon Terracini, Nigel Jamieson, Scott Rankin, Fiona Winning, and Marion Potts. The Rex Cramphorn Memorial Lecture Series was relaunched last year with the artistic director of UK company Forced Entertainment, Tim Etchell's lecture, In Place, Once More of Another, delivered by Terry O'Connor. Tonight, we are truly delighted that John Collins has accepted our invitation to deliver the 16th lecture. John Collins founded Elevator Repair Service Theatre, ERS, in New York City in 1991, along with a small group of actors, many of whom he had known in college at Yale, where he had graduated the same year. Shortly after founding ERS and concurrent with his directing work there, John began working as a sound designer and technician for several New York City experimental theatre companies, including Target Margin Theatre, Richard Foreman's Ontological Hysteric Theatre, and the Worcester Group. John was a member of the creative ensemble at the Worcester Group from 1993 to 2006, and he worked on several major projects of theirs, including The Hairy Ape, House Lights, and To You, the Birdie. During this time, John was building up ERS and directing or co-directing all of the company's work. He left the Worcester Group in 2007 to become ERS's full-time artistic director. In 2005, 20 years ago, he directed ERS's breakthrough work, Gatz, a multi-award-winning staging of the entire text of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Gatz and ERS's subsequent works have been seen all over the world, and the company has been recognised with numerous accolades, including an Obie Award for Sustained Excellence. John is also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a United States Artists Fellowship, and Doris Duke Performing Artist Award. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife and young son, who is, of course, a Bluey fan. John comes to us today straight from the Adelaide Festival, where they presented Gatz on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Barbara tells me that there was a standing ovation for the performance and 4 curtain calls on Saturday night. Please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thank you, Laura. It's true. He is a big Bluey fan. Thank you very much for having me today. I didn't realize I was going to be following Tim Etchell, so I'm already a little intimidated by that. Tim is a genius. I want to talk today about Gatz, the theater piece that you just heard about. Ooh, it's getting dark. It's a piece that I made with my company, Elevator Repair Service. I'm going to talk about how we made it, why we made it the way we did, and I'm going to go back a little bit in our history to try to identify the roots of this idea in some of the earlier work that we did. Gatz is a performance of the entire text of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Whole novel, cover to cover, nothing more, nothing less. The action of the performance takes place against the backdrop of a kind of dingy back office somewhere in some anonymous business sometime in the not too distant past, where a worker comes in, begins his day by attempting to start his computer. Computer is giving him some trouble. He starts to lose interest in it. And instead he finds a copy of The Great Gatsby in his desk and starts to read it out loud to himself. Over the course of the next 8 hours, we hear the entire text of the book. The book's characters are eventually embodied by various co-workers of his around this mysterious office. And that employee who we first meet at the beginning becomes the narrator of the novel, Nick Carraway. Now, over the course of the performance, there are changes in lighting, sound, and some costumes, and they bring a kind of new reality to what we see when we first come into the theater. But that scenic idea never changes. The office is always there as a backdrop to the novel. So it is both F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic story from the 1920s, but it's also the story of a reader getting lost in a great book. Now, as we said, my company is called Elevator Repair Service Theater. So I thought I might, before I go into any of this process stuff, tell you why we're called that, because I always get that question and I always forget to answer it. So the name of the company began a long string of nonsensical decisions on our part. I'll go on to talk about why we do things that don't make sense and why we think ultimately that can be the most effective and revealing way to tell a story or communicate an idea. But the name Elevator Repair Service started as a joke with a colleague of mine, James Hannaham, who with 4 or 5 other young theater artists founded the company with me in 1991. Now that should give you an idea of how in those early years we did not take ourselves too seriously. I had shared a story with James about how when I was about 11 years old, there I am right there, my cousin and I there took, for fun, took a computer survey meant to help unemployed adults find a job. Now, I lost my place already. I was doing this for fun, but this 1980 computer that I was talking to didn't know that. So it did its best to give me a good idea of what kind of job I should apply for based on my interests. The survey asked questions like, do you like to work with other people? Do you like to work with your hands? Do you like using technology? Et cetera, et cetera. So among the many interesting career recommendations that we got was elevator repairman. And so about a decade later, James and I thought, well, if we start a theater company, we have to name it Elevator Repair Service so we can make that prophecy come true. Enough of that. So that was the very beginning of the company in 1991. But that willingness that we had then to not make sense has persisted in different ways for 35 years. What started then as a sort of rebellious impulse eventually became a philosophy, if not a process. Now, this calls to mind an acting exercise I heard about called wrong name. It's an exercise where you point to an object and without thinking, call it something that it is not. Point to a table and say banana. Point to a coffee cup and say freight train. Or point to a theater company and say elevator repair service. And the idea behind this exercise is to trick the actor's brain into acting intuitively, to bypass the intellect and activate their spontaneous imagination. Now, in retrospect, it's what we did in naming our company. It's also an early illustration of what grew into an approach to making original work for us. We look for creative inspiration in deliberate contradiction. Now, Gatz was our 11th original show, and it evolved over several restarts and reincarnations between 1999 and 2005. It also ushered in a new era for the company where we became very focused on and well known for our work with literature. But it nevertheless followed a path we'd been on for many years. It was another in a string of projects in which we challenged ourselves to do something seemingly impossible on stage. As early as 1995, we were looking for projects that, on paper anyway, didn't make a lot of sense. Our goals were often pretty hard to describe back then. I remember when we were in the process of making our 5th show, which this is, old video stills here, forgive the quality. I was talking on the phone with a New York Times reporter, and I think it was the first time I had ever talked to a fancy New York Times reporter on the phone. And I was trying to explain what we were up to with the show that we were making. I must have been talking about creating a kind of opaque chaos on stage. And I think I talked about how we want to make our audience laugh, but not know why they're laughing. We were very excited about making work that was both comical and strange, joyful and dense. I don't really remember exactly what I said to this reporter, but I do remember his response to my attempt to describe Elevator Repair Services' work. And that was simply, why would you want to do that to your audience? And I was taken aback by that question, because in my mind, I was just trying to explain and tell him about the great experience I wanted to give the audience. But I realize now that why would you want to do that to your audience is a reasonable question for a lot of our work. Much of what we do begins with some very questionable proposition, some idea or assignment that we hope will elicit exactly that kind of skepticism that this reporter expressed. Like read a novel cover to cover on stage, or stage The Great Gatsby in a rundown 1980s office. I think these two qualify as that kind of skepticism-inducing proposition. We've always wanted to set seemingly absurd goals for ourselves that not only elicit skepticism in our audiences, but also in ourselves. We want to do the wrong thing on stage. Now, what I mean by wrong is not something that's going to produce a bad result. In fact, I mean just the opposite of that. We learned very early on that setting up a problem to solve was a great way to activate our intuitive creativity. If we told ourselves to do something on stage that we thought was impossible, then our desperate attempts to do it would yield some very productive failures. These could take many forms. In our early shows in the 1990s, we liked the idea of smashing two things together on stage that did not belong together. We were drawn to the friction between disparate forms and content. This was rooted in a real contrarian impulse that we had and that I had pretty strongly back then. And now looking back at my 22-year-old self, I see a rebellious, aspiring, avant-garde artist who just wanted to do anything except regular theater. But this youthful impulse to be unconventional took us to some genuinely productive places. And it took us there once rigor and commitment were applied. And it eventually led us to decide to stage The Great Gatsby, every word of it, without adapting it at all, without changing it, without trying to make it read like a play. Another way of describing this approach to making theater is to use a term that I think over my life has become somewhat stigmatized. But it's a term that I very much identify with, and that is experimental. We make work by conducting experiments. So these works typically do not begin with a plan so much as a question. Sometimes that question is, can you do X on stage? Or what will happen if you do X on stage? In the case of Gatz, the question is, what will happen if you try to perform an entire novel on stage without adapting it? The implication with a lot of these questions or experiments is that they will lead to some kind of failure, or at least the answer to the question might be, well, you can't do it, or it just doesn't work. But in the process of getting to that answer, in the process of failing to do that thing, you find something else. And that something else is an outcome you couldn't have planned or even imagined before sincerely committing yourself to executing a task that might be impossible. I'm speaking a lot about failure in this happy, productive way. And I get that idea, and my appreciation of that notion has been helped along and greatly informed by the writing and thinking of Dr. Sarah Jane Bales. Dr. Bales wrote about ERS in her book, Performance Theater and the Poetics of Failure. And she articulates this idea much better than I am now, or that I will. But she's very interested in failure in process or as process, and also depictions of failure on stage. Notions of how dramatizing something not working has become a part of the vocabulary of contemporary performance. She also writes about forced entertainment and Tim Etchell's company in this book. She describes live performance as essentially rooted in the failure of representation. Sarah became interested in our work and its relationship to failure when she saw a 1998 piece of ours called Cab Legs, which is another name that doesn't make any sense. Cab Legs was a breakthrough piece for ERS, and it came about as a result of a crisis of confidence. That crisis came about because we had had limited success on a certain scale with our strategy for making theater. That is, we thought that the right thing to do was to take two disparate subjects or forms, smash them together, and try to make them talk to each other. Let them determine how you did the other. Let them create a kind of accidental synthesis. For example, we staged an absurdist biographical piece about the comedian Andy Kaufman using old How to Speak Dutch records. That show succeeded on a number of levels for us. It was exciting to make. We discovered things. We thought we'd hit on something. We thought we'd figured something out. So, of course, then we thought, let's just try to keep doing that. But after 5 years or so, it did not seem to be working very well. We were trying to follow our own formula for making good theater. Theater that would be received as uniquely elevator repair service work. But rather than cementing our artistic identity, which was our goal, we found we were making things that felt uninspired, ideas that were planned and not discovered. And as a result, they were not much fun for us to make. So after much frustration and nearly giving up, we got together and decided that the best way to work our way out of that crisis would be to do the opposite of what we thought we should do. Try to make the show that we, ERS, would never make. So many years later, I learned about a technique that the playwright Mac Wellman uses with his graduate playwrights at Brooklyn College. He tells them, try to write the play you would most hate. And that completely counterintuitive prompt very much speaks to what we were trying to get ourselves to do then when we were in that crisis. We wanted to make something that we would hate. Or rather, we wanted to see what would happen if we gave ourselves the assignment to make something that contradicted all of our past practices and even our tastes. Now, obviously, we didn't want to hate what we made, but we were trying to shake our collective brain out of a rut. And it worked. We decided that based on what we had been doing for the past 5 years, what we would never do is stage a love story and an actual well-known dramatic text, a play. We gave ourselves what was, for us at the time, the most onerous and distasteful task: stage a Tennessee Williams play. This one. This was the worst thing our young avant-garde minds could think of. And it had the desired effect. As we attempted to stage Summer and Smoke, all of our contrarian impulses came racing back to the foreground. But this time, not because we thought that's what we should do, but because we were having a genuine and deeply intuitive reaction. Sure enough, I hated the way the dialogue sounded. It felt neither immediate nor real, and my deep-seated urge to make unconventional theater took over again. I was working that way from an urgent need to solve a problem, albeit a problem that I'd given myself. But most importantly, I was not working from a plan. Now, I had the I had to use those impulses to work my way out of a problem. I was trying to stage some regular theater, and I was predictably having a strong allergic reaction to the language and the form. I reflexively rejected the sound of the dialogue, so I had the actors paraphrase their lines instead, say them in their own words instead of memorizing and repeating the dialogue written by Tennessee Williams. And furthermore, once we were in performance from night to night, the actors were not allowed to paraphrase the same way twice. So in other words, we weren't just going to write our own play based on that play, one in which I would approve of the sound of the dialogue. The actors had to think of new ways to say their lines every night, new words. Now that show proved to be a breakthrough for our still pretty young company, and it began to put us on the map. It also included quite a lot of dancing, which we developed before forcing ourselves to try Tennessee Williams, and you see some of that there. So Cab Legs enshrined for us a kind of distaste for the written word. The absolute authority of an author's words felt to me then oppressive and antithetical to making good theater, because theater was not about writing. Theater, to me, was about experience. Theater was about action. Theater was about real things happening in real space and real time. Whereas words on the page were something fixed, dead, from the past. And this characterized much of our work during that period. But like our earlier attempts to formulate a consistent approach to theater making, this too got stale, fortunately. In 1999, we were beginning to contemplate a next piece. And as with much of our work, an idea came about as a casual suggestion. My co-director at the time suggested that we should see what we could do with The Great Gatsby, which he had just reread. Now, at the time, I did not know the book very well. I was one of the rare American high school students who did not read it. I didn't have any idea about how to stage it, and I definitely didn't have an idea about staging it verbatim. It was merely a very general proposition. What would happen if we tried to make something, anything, using this book? I remember clearly at the time imagining that The Great Gatsby itself would probably not even be recognizable in our finished product, whatever that turned out to be. The success of Cab Legs, where Summer and Smoke was virtually unrecognizable in the end, was still fresh in my mind. And I was excited to put this new text through a similar, harshly transformative process. We thought of our creative method then as a kind of blender where you poured in some ingredients and you pureed them. And hopefully they all came out and came together into something interesting, some interesting new thing that was the result of the numerous failures and attendant new discoveries that would come about during that process. So without any plan, we started work by looking for scenes in the novel which would lend themselves to being performed. We had to get on our feet and do something. We looked for scenes with lots of dialogue. But even in those early experiments with staging a couple of scenes from the novel, we found that we could not come to a consistent method, a consistent idea for how to edit this text, how to condense it into theater. This time, paraphrasing did not even occur to us. So despite all of our past ideological opposition to text and writing, we were finding that this seemed to be a more or less perfectly written novel. Whatever Fitzgerald was doing in constructing his sentences and paragraphs did not tolerate any editing or rearranging. Cutting even he said or she said felt like a kind of violence and certainly did not create any kind of improvement. The novel seemed to be making a demand of us as we tried to work our way through it. And that apparent refusal to be edited gave me something that I had been looking for, an impossible task to pursue. Don't adapt a single word, stage all of it. be so radically committed to these words that were not meant to be performed on stage and let them create a provocative obstacle. Don't cut, don't edit, don't rewrite. Now, I did not think that was going to work. I did not think that we would succeed in accomplishing the task we'd given ourselves. I seized on that idea of not cutting a word because I was sure that the idea was going to fail in some interesting way. I was confident that there was no reasonable way to stage every bit of text from a novel as a piece of theater. It seemed impossible, or at least ridiculous or ill-advised, and that made it a very tempting experiment for us. Not because I could predict the result, but because I could not. I had a pretty good confidence that the attempt to do that thing would fail in some unpredictable and exciting way. It turns out that the real failure there, the one I did not anticipate, was what did ultimately happen, which is that it did work. It was not impossible, after all. Even though I sincerely anticipated this would not succeed, it's important to say that we still went into that experiment with total commitment. We knew that if these anticipated, though unknown failures were going to generate something inspiring, we would first have to try very earnestly to succeed. So, we made sure that the scenes we staged, even the earliest workshops, included every bit of Fitzgerald's language and didn't add a word to it. It was this commitment that let us discover the scenic element and framing device for the play. So when we had made the commitment to attempt the entire text, we realized that the first few pages of the novel were going to be some of the more challenging to dramatize because they didn't have much dialogue. They didn't indicate much action, and they were generally philosophical reflections by the narrator on himself, his background, and generally on the story that he was about to tell. So I decided to meet casually in the small office above a theater where I was working, my Worcester Group sound job. This is the performing garage where the Worcester Group works. And I'd recruited two actors. One was Scott Shepard, who was going to play Nick Carraway, and the other was James Urbaniak, who had signed on to be our Gatsby. We had already tinkered with a few scenes later in the novel, and we'd stitched together a few parts without really forcing ourselves to deal with some of the novel's longer stretches of exposition. And until that point, we hadn't really dared to look at the first page. We were still looking for the parts that we thought might give us something to work with, but we hadn't touched the first page. So we're sitting upstairs in a small office full of storage shelves, a couple of old desks, and a not very modern computer. And this is a very grainy look at that office. That's just inside some of those windows upstairs. And I propose, just as a way of getting started, getting us on our feet, that we try treating that little space as though it were the set for the show. That was one of the first questions I asked. What if this were the set for the show? What would that mean? What choices would that imply? The room itself was a kind of found object. And as an exercise, we decided to see what kind of Great Gatsby might occur in that cramped little space. And that was not an entirely new way of working for us. We liked to work backwards, we used to say. We would take a design idea, one that we were interested in purely as a design idea, and start there and see how that design idea spoke to the text we were using, or see if it even suggested a text. It was a familiar way for me to get something going by throwing two things together that maybe didn't belong together. In 2002, we'd made a piece called Room Tone, and the entire project had begun simply with the question, what happens when you perform an entire play in near total darkness? From there, we got the idea of doing a ghost story. And then from there, we chose Henry James's Turn of the Screw. So we'd worked, starting with design, backwards into a text. So here we were in this office that really had nothing at all to do with the with the Great Gatsby, its story, its characters, or its era. And we had to find a way then to make the two things make some kind of sense together. So looking around this office, I decided that Scott and James would be employees of a fictional business, and we would begin playing with the idea that Scott was obsessively reading The Great Gatsby to himself at work. And he kept trying to hide it from his boss. So it sort of started as a little bit of a game, a kind of slapsticky joke of sorts. We'd stage Scott diving under the desk and still reading whenever James would walk into the office. But that one little experiment in that small office yielded an entire concept. Not because we were looking for a big concept, but more because we were just looking for a way to solve the problem of how could we justify speaking the not very dramatic first few pages of the book. What I saw in that little experiment was that on one level, this could be a piece about the act of reading. That immediately gave us an answer to the question, what is the action here and when there's no action implied? One small experiment became a larger experiment. We started as, how do we get through the first page? And that became, what happens when we let the entire novel unfold against this backdrop? So about a year later, with a bit of the first chapter staged, a little bit of the fourth chapter staged, and a little bit of the fifth chapter staged, all adhering to this idea that we must not adapt, that we cannot cut a single word. We then set about plowing through the entire novel in order, now with 13 actors. And we were in another found space. We relocated our office set to a small garage in Brooklyn that featured a door to the street right on the, I wonder if the pointer works. Yeah, there's a door that goes out onto the street right over there. And we started incorporating that into our imagined office space. And the setting began to evolve. So it's really important to say right here that even then, even with a concept formed, this still represented to me a proposal that probably was impossible and was likely to fail. I didn't know how it was going to fail, but I had a pretty good idea that as we worked our way through the novel, somewhere I thought around chapter 4, this idea would break. We had to find out where exactly it was going to break and how, and then what that would mean for navigating our way through the rest of the novel. Did that mean we would have to let our strategy collapse and adopt a new one in response to it? Would it mean we would have to go back to the beginning and apply some new paradigm that we had discovered in the failure of the first one? We didn't know. I was only sure that we would hit a point where this radical idea of not adapting would finally collapse under its own weight. But it just didn't ever happen. What happened instead was that we began to develop a kind of bespoke theatrical vocabulary, one that kept giving us new ways to answer the question of how do we stage this entire novel. And countless pieces of random office junk populated our set, things we just grabbed and threw in there. That reimagined found space became a kind of treasure trunk of found objects that could be imaginatively transformed by this language we had committed ourselves to using. Now, in working through the various problems that each new page and each new chapter gave us, we started to codify a set of rules that we could use moving forward. They were rules that emerged from the constant, committed, and sincere effort to do this whole novel aloud, using only what this oddly incorrect setting offered. Eventually, the set became this. And that's where the door that used to go onto the street found its way into the set. This table had emerged from the old desk at the Performing Garage's office. And the computer also was inspired by that space. Now, when we made it through chapter 4, and there did not come a moment where I thought, this is now too much and this is not working, that's when I first started to suspect that this idea might not fail after all. One thing that was happening as we were navigating these problems like how are they in a car now? How are they in a mansion now? How do these random office workers start to become these characters? Something that happened was that we started to find that we were really enjoying the friction between the ideas and images of the novel and the comically inadequate tools we had to represent them. A rolling chair became a limousine. File cabinets hid liquor bottles. Our Gatsby actor was not a 30-year-old heartthrob, but this balding middle-aged man. And there was a delightful irony to describing Gatsby's toilet set of pure dull gold by having an actor pick up an old broken kitchen spatula off the desk and gaze into it like she was looking into a beautiful mirror, or brush her hair with an old wooden spoon standing in for a fancy brush that's being described in the novel. These jarring disconnections between the language and the imagery of our set and props, and even our people, were so woefully inadequate, so comically wrong, let the language of the novel stand out in relief. And my company has always bonded over a shared sense of humor and a kind of irreverence we have and that we've never been afraid of, regardless of how serious the material is we're working on. And I think over the years, we have used that kind of contrast or ironic distance, not to tear things down, but to let them exist fully as imaginative ideas against a backdrop of a kind of awkward lo-fi reality. What we have always found, and what we found in particular staging The Great Gatsby this way, was that the act of enthusiastically employing found objects as a way of enacting what is described in beautiful and lyrical language was not only satisfying in its irreverence, but perversely seemed to do some great justice to the language itself, because it didn't try to replace it with accurate representations. It let the language stand and didn't compete with it so much as give it an obstacle to overcome. And in the process, that obstacle itself could be transformed. We like to set up battles with the original language, battles that the language will ultimately win. So as we worked deeper into the novel, something that told us we were on the right track was that we found this to be a very honest and accurate way to dramatize the experience of reading a book. I think we've all had the experience of becoming lost in a great book and suddenly seeing it and hearing it and sensing it in the real world around us. Even if that world has no clear relationship whatsoever to what you're reading. One does not have to be reading The Great Gatsby inside an ostentatious mansion on Long Island. And you don't need to be there in that place to begin to see everything around you, nonetheless. With language like this in this novel, you could be sitting in a drab, windowless office, totally engrossed, and you will start to see and hear and experience the characters and its story in the purity of your imagination's projection. In Gatz, that friction, that contradiction, let the text feel uncorrupted and truthful. There was a truthfulness that we had stumbled on as we tried to pursue this ridiculous assignment that we thought would surely lead to failure. And as we worked our way through the book and moved back and forth between an imagined reality of the book and the very immediate and banal reality of our setting for it, we started to gain an understanding of the novel itself. Now, most adaptations or interpretations that you see of The Great Gatsby cannot resist all of its striking visual elements, the period details, the flappers, the yellow car, the elaborate details of Gatsby's mansion, and the parties that he throws there. But as you go deeper into this novel, it becomes clear that Fitzgerald sets up all of those things just to tear them down. We learn in the novel that Jay Gatsby is not Jay Gatsby, the self-made liver of the American dream, but he is instead James Gatz, a poor Midwesterner whose riches come from organized crime. So where Gatz begins is where the novel ultimately lands. By chapter 8, Gatsby's exotic and mysterious exterior has fallen away to reveal a very unglamorous person who's done everything that he has done just because of his desperate and tragic love for Daisy. He creates a whole world to win her back, and in doing that, he ultimately fails. The story in the end is about a tragic return to where he came from. And maybe more than that, this is a story about the narrator, Nick Carraway, rejecting the glamorous East Coast life he has just had a taste of in favor of his modest Midwestern origin. Now, I can't claim that this is why we chose this way of telling the story of the Great Gatsby. We didn't have that insight at first, and we didn't use it to craft a performance. Instead, it was a truth about the novel that we discovered in going about it in a counterintuitive way. In the end, none of this experimentation is worth very much unless it reveals something. And one of our goals was to let this book be a book. Let it be a book on stage and stay out and just try to stay out of its way. Find what it had to say to us rather than what we had to say about it. It was an experiment, a genuinely open-ended question. We let the novel speak for itself. Instead of indulging in the trappings of Gatsby's glamorous superficiality, we rooted ourselves, somewhat accidentally at first, in the tragic and unglamorous reality where the novel lands. And from all the detached irony and counterintuitive imagery of our semi-contemporary back office, something essential emerged. So finally, I would not have learned very much from this experience if what I took away from it was yet another formula for making good work. Since creating Gatz, we've gone on to make adaptations of 3 other novels, and we may be about to start work on a 4th. But we still have to reinvent the process every time. The older I get and the more work ERS has to its name, the more challenging that need for reinvention becomes. I would love to be able to look at Gatz and say, okay, this is how we do it from now on, and it'll always work this well. But as it turns out, to keep making successful experimental work, you just have to keep experimenting, finding new ways to ask questions you do not know the answers to. When I reflect on it, what I take away from the experience of making Gatz and performing it for 21 years now is that doing things the wrong way still works. Doing things backwards still works. And finding a way to make a radical commitment to an improbable or impossible task will lead to discoveries that are revealing, inspiring, and truthful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Well, of course, I feel very privileged to have seen the work so recently. I think there are other people who've seen it. I know Deborah saw it on Friday and Malcolm saw it many years ago. Has anyone? 2010. Philip, when did you see it? In London, yeah. Has anyone else seen it?
Here in Sydney in 2009.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's good to have those people in the audience. It is funny that you talked about Eugene O'Neill. Is that who you? No, Tennessee Williams. So early on. And I was thinking, that you you felt you were able to really kind of destroy or do some kind of disservice to Tennessee Williams, and yet so respected this F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. And how much do you think that was to do with,
Maturity.
well, maturity, but also the nature of a play that's put out there to, you know, it offers itself to interpretation and to change, and yet novels generally are, you know, they're published and they, you know, they can't be changed.
Mhm.
So, and how much, yes, what do you put that down to?
Well, I think that in those earlier years, we were really excited about the idea of making the thing ourselves, and for our ensemble to be the ones that figured out how this thing we were working on became theater. And I think we rejected dramatic literature or plays because we felt like too many of the problems had already been solved for us.
Right.
That was part of it. And I think we were just impatient. You know, I think now, around the time we came to the Great Gatsby, we were starting to develop a little maturity and a little patience. And we got interested then in the idea that that if we wanted a problem to solve, that making ourselves stick to the words of the author would be a really interesting one. I think it helped that it was a novel and it wasn't supposed to be on stage. So we could still feel like we were doing something wrong.
Yeah.
But you know, I think we've grown up some since then. But the impulse to try something that might not work or that shouldn't work is what sort of carried through.
And applied itself in each of those cases, even
Yeah.
other texts. Has anyone got a question at the ready? Yes, I think Ian Maxwell in the background there. Can I just?
Thank you.
We're going to get.
We're going to get on time.
You're not on the record yet.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you about the 21 years in between, in the course of which the world has turned under you. So from, you know, those early moments of Barack Obama to now, what's the status of the truth you discovered in the context of that 21 years?
Well, in the book, you mean? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the reason that my colleague brought The Great Gatsby to us as an idea was because it was 1999, I think, and he thought, oh, this reminds me of the 20s, remind me of now, because there's the dot-com boom. You know, there was all kinds of new money everywhere, and a sort of exuberance among the newly rich then. And he thought, well, what if maybe there's some resonance here. You know, I think a couple of things. Look, there's an obvious, I mean, Tom Buchanan is the villain in this book, and he's a racist, a white supremacist, and an idiot. And turns out that's very relevant these days in my country, as we're being led by someone like that. I honestly think Tom Buchanan is more sympathetic. So, you know, I think on the one hand, there are cultural and political ideas in the novel that, even though it's over 100 years old, that still have some resonance. But ultimately, I think that, you know, we find some solace in this novel, in spite of whatever contemporary resonance it might have, because there's a kind of timelessness to the story of people coming to understand who they are. And I think that's his real achievement, and which gets lost sometimes. You know.
Can I follow up very quickly? So does any of that inflect what happens when you sit down to rework the piece and to bring new actors into the company? Do you talk about those shifts?
Do I talk about
the historical shifts, the sort of
Oh,
view from 2026? Or
well, I mean, this has been the same company performing it for 21 years. So, you know, with some exceptions, there are some people who came into it not right at the beginning, but a little later. But it's been a very committed ensemble. For the 13 roles, there are probably about 22 people who play them at different times. And what we learned over all that time, you know, is that it actually seems to help tell the story with older people, which I was always, you know, when we were doing this in 2005 and we were having a lot of trouble getting the rights to it, the Fitzgerald estate did not want us to do this at first. I thought, well, we got to do it now because we're going to age out of these roles. You know, Lorena there, who's Myrtle with her head thrown back, you know, she's 61 now, I think. And Scott is 58. You know, it's been a long time since anyone was age appropriate, but it's been one of the sort of accidental sort of dissonances that has this proved to be revealing in a strange way. Yeah.
This is a kind of very local question because there are a lot of theatre makers in the room, past, present and emerging, as we like to say. And, you know, just the idea of a company that sustains itself over the period that elevator repair service has is unimaginable, I'd have to say, in this country for this kind of work, because there is a strong history of, you know, what are we going you know, wanting experimental work, contemporary performance. We've gone post-dramatic, you know, we've gone through the full spectrum of naming it. But I think one of the things that it's very hard to do in a country that's as small as Australia probably is to actually sustain. And there are many reasons why ensembles don't keep going, but it's just interesting to me. And so I'm interested in how you do that,
Well,
and how you have done that.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of opportunity to reflect on this over the years. And I think one thing that I've learned is that, you know, it's another sort of truthful but counterintuitive idea is that an ensemble that's going to last, that's going to endure, has to always be willing to fall apart, has to be always on the verge of, you know, exploding. And you know, there've been times over the years when I thought, oh, we can't do this anymore. You know, there are too many like toxic relationships in the company. So-and-so's sleeping with so-and-so. They're going to never speak to each other again. How am I going to ever make another show? You know, I really wanted to have a rock band when I first started out. You know, I wanted my theater company to be the same, like 6 people. You'd always see them. They'd always be doing the same thing. And because I was a big fan of the Worcester Group, and I thought that's what they were. I've learned working there that they're not. You know, I guess the short answer is I always try to treat whoever is in the room with me as a permanent ensemble, even if 2 or 3 of them are brand new. The idea of ensemble work always trumps the idea of you know, the structure or some rigid structure. So, you know, we just always have to be ready to fall apart and let people go who want to go, bring in new people frequently. I was having a conversation with, we actually did bring in a new actor in Adelaide. Jim Fletcher, who plays, the actor who plays Gatsby, in the end, we wanted a new actor to appear as his father. We thought that should be a sort of exciting new thing to happen at the end of the book. A new actor appears, an actual old man walks on stage to collect Gatsby's body. And that part had always been played by Jim's real dad, who was not an actor, but a doctor. And now he is in his 90s and can't travel anymore. And so we had a new actor in Adelaide, and it was a great experience to find this local actor who was recommended through some casting people here in Sydney. And that kind of thing just really energizes the company. But he told me about a study that he had read about Broadway shows between like 1950 and 2015, and they had studied them to see what makes the most successful show? Is it a group of people who have always worked together, who knew each other really well? And it was a sort of graph where the more people in the cast who knew each other and had worked together before, the more there were, the more successful the show got up to a point. And then as you had more and more people in that company who had worked together before, then the show started to get less and less successful. And that there was some kind of magical balance in there. New people who didn't know each other working together for the first time, and people who'd worked together for decades. And so I think we try to maintain that kind of ensemble. I think that's how it works.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was curious to know if you know anything about the publication history of another of Fitzgerald's novels, Tender as the Night, whereby he writes it one way and it's a commercial failure, and he's convinced that there's something wrong with the structure and second guesses it, publishes it another way. And the critical consensus almost 100 years on is that he had it right the first time. So I'm thinking about that issue of radical commitment and intuition, which you also mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering how second guessing works in your method, in your process, and how you engage with it, work around it, what you do with the inclination to doubt or second guess your commitments.
Yeah, well, we take, I think the best work that we make tends to happen in many iterations. This piece started as we were going to do the Great Gatsby. We were going to try to include all the language, but we were going to do it with puppets instead of people. And in fact, there's one slide back to it now, but where you see a sort of like a coffee thermos with eyeballs on it. That was from the original production. I mean, there are so many ideas that get sort of chewed up and spat out over time. Yeah, it's full of second guessing. I mean, I think it's for me as a director, I have to keep putting myself in a situation where a new audience is seeing the work and just sort of measure my degree of humiliation. And then if it's high, I've got to go back to the drawing board. But, so there's, with live performance, you have to just keep putting it in front of an audience. And that's where you get the most honest kinds of second guessing, I guess. It's iterative. And so, it's just part of that whole notion of not really trusting your plans. There's an experience and you just know on some gut level that it's working. And you always have to be, I worked for the director, Elizabeth Lecomte, for a long time. And she's amazing in that it could be the end of a long rehearsal period. There's an audience coming that night. We're rehearsing in the afternoon, and she just says, "No, you know what? This isn't working. We're gonna do this whole scene a completely different way, and you won't get a chance to rehearse it before the audience comes in." But that willingness to keep tearing it up and starting over, I learned a lot from.
Hi. We were lucky to watch the show on Friday,
Good.
and while I knew we were walking into a word-for-word rendition of The Great Gatsby, as we were watching the first act, I found myself really trying to hold on to the stories of the characters on stage as office workers, worrying about how long can he read this book before his computer is fixed, and so on and so forth. And yet by the end of the whole play, we close without resolving the story that's been created on stage outside of the Great Gatsby characters. I think I walked out with a similar understanding to what you shared, which is this was a story about getting lost in a good book.
Mm-hmm.
But was there any point where you were creating this work where you felt more resolution for the world you'd created on stage was necessary? Or
Yeah, we actually struggled with that a good bit, and we had a couple of different inspirations for it. There was this place we used to go to get our party invitations printed or our bulk mailing done, and it looked a little bit like this office. It was like stacks of banker boxes and paper everywhere, and it looked anachronistic. It seemed like it was from, the 1980s and not, I mean, at the time it was only the 1990s, I guess. But so we thought, oh, it's in a place like that. And we did try to imagine, like, well, who are these people? What are they actually doing? There's a scene where they're stuffing envelopes and everybody's pitching in. But ultimately, we just decided to let that remain sort of a mystery. And I think part of the reason we let ourselves do that and didn't try to decide what is it, who are these people? Like, who are those characters that we meet at first? Was one, because it felt like the novel in a way. It felt like Gatsby, and how people are always speculating about who he is and what he does. And there's a lot of there's all this dishonesty in the way he presents himself. And in the novel, ultimately, what makes it powerful, what makes the story work, is that you just stop caring about those things, and there's these more profound truths beneath that. So in a way, it was very aspirational, and I don't know if we really achieved this, but we really wanted to just let the reality of the novel come in and bulldoze everything else out of the way, and just let that become the only truth that was there. But yeah, we struggled with that a lot. We were like, trying to figure out how we make certain decisions, or like, what are they doing? And everybody has their own internal answers to these questions. The woman who plays the secretary at some point decided that she was in love with the Gatsby guy. And, if you look closely at the desk over there, at her desk, there's a picture. Actually, there's a picture on this desk of, it's a different actor who's doing it now, but we put her picture there. This woman and Jim, who plays Gatsby, there's a picture of them together at the Lone Pine Koala Sanctuary north of Brisbane, holding a koala, and she's got it up there because she's like, that's her secret story. Like, she's in love with him, and that was the best day of her life.
Having been through this process a few times and for a long time, what is the intellectual case for radical commitment versus interpretation, do you think?
Well, it's a really good question, because, what I'm taking for granted is that these sort of radical acts of commitment of applying yourself to something without a firm plan for where it's going to take you, it's just based on this, I guess, faith that I have that that's going to yield something. And it's really, ultimately, what I think it comes down to is, it's very personal. It's just that this is how I get joy out of work, is if the work is about putting myself in a place where I can discover something, not intellectually crafting the result, but letting myself stumble into it. And that, that gets harder and harder to do. It's in some ways, it's a very easy thing to do when you're young and you are naive and you're just casting about trying to figure something out and you don't know what you're doing. But I guess I just had enough experiences early on where there was some real joy in those discoveries that happened that way. So, it's ultimately just something intuitive, I guess. I mean, it's difficult to make the intellectual case for it, really. I mean, I'm trying to do it here today, but it's a kind of, I mean, maybe it's something like that acting exercise where, it's an idea about how your brain actually works, and particularly how your creative brain works. It's about getting out of your own way, not overthinking. maybe the idea is that there is another part of your brain, not just as an artist, but as a human being, that can recognize when something's working, that can recognize success of a certain kind, when it happens by accident. And I think it's really just about finding ways for me to put myself in that place. But yeah, I mean, on some level, it's anti-intellectual. You know, it's about not thinking. It's about acting from some kind of instinct. So you just have to keep believing that that thing is real. You know, hopefully it is.
You said earlier on, you were asked, why would you do that to your audience? And you've described the process, but do you find that answer, you know, whether it's chapter 4 or 8 or before you go on the stage, or are you still, until you're in front of the audience, not answering that for yourself, that experimentation?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think of myself as, or at least a big part of my job as the director is to be the audience's representative from the very beginning, to be someone who watches and experiences the thing that's happening and, you know, has a reaction to it. And I try to identify, well, what's giving me the most positive reaction? What's giving me the most joy? And, you know, I do have my own very particular tastes, and I've surrounded myself with a group of people who share a lot of them. So again, it's a kind of act of faith that, you know, we were talking about second guessing before, and I have to not, on some level, I have to not second guess when I feel a genuine reaction to something that I see. And I have to believe that, you know, I'm making the work for an audience that I don't know, but I'm making it with the kind of faith that a thing that gives me joy is going to give them joy too. So I'm always thinking about them. But, you know, as I said, because I don't want to, you know, maybe I'm just terrified of going into a situation where I'm going to just completely experiment on the audience. I think there are people who do that, you know, who are maybe more gutsy than I am that way. But you know, I'm going in there hoping they're going to enjoy this thing. But when I do, when I sit there in a room with a bunch of people who haven't been sitting in rehearsal for 6 weeks, you know, it forces a kind of honesty on you. So, you know, and I think over time I've learned too, like that whole thing about why would you do that to your audience was very upsetting to hear, you know, when I was 25, because I was like, what do you mean? Why would I do that to my audience? They're going to love this, you know? But I realize now, and in particular with Gatz, like, you know, I love it when people walk into Gatz extremely skeptical. You know, I mean, I'm very lucky to have this piece because it's been going on for long enough and enough people have seen it and liked it that I'm less afraid of what the audience might think. You know, it's a very rare privilege to have something like this that, you know, we can bring it to Adelaide last week and this past weekend, and I don't have to worry too much, you know. But so you know, it's an ideal in a way to do something that the audience is going to be very skeptical of walking in the door, and just to know that you have a chance to win them over. Like, it's a longer journey for them that way, but it's that much more satisfying.
Hi. You talked about that excitement of when an audience sees what you've been doing. And you talk about your reaction to seeing that as the preparation, rehearsals, whatever you want to call them, unfold.
Mm-hmm.
Do you wait right up until that grand opening to have an audience, or have you got people coming through the door? I'm aware that Worcester's used to kind of do odd open kind of things.
Exactly. Yeah, I did. You know, I'm sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously, I modeled what we do off of what they do because I'd read about it. I'd been exposed to it. I worked there, but I also just loved what they did. So I wanted to know what made that work that I loved so much. I want to know how they did that. And I was aware that they were that they were working in this very iterative way where they would do a work in progress after they had just half an hour's worth. And that is the way that a lot of our work happens. Sometimes the best way that it happens is if we have a deadline and we think something's supposed to be done by, a certain date, and we work really hard to get it done for that date. And then of course we realize it's not done, and we get lucky and we have another chance to do it. So, we're always working on things. I mean, I'm still seeing things in this show that I like, oh, that could be better. Oh, I get it now. It's 21 years later. So we do really believe in the sort of work in progress ideal, and how that whole structure, get people in to see something at some point, get a sense of where you're at, because it's working with an ensemble like this. It's people they're your friends, everybody's on the same page. You can get a very distorted idea of what you're doing that way. I mean, it cuts both ways. It's why the work has the kind of texture that it does, because we all know each other. But it can also be the thing that makes us not see what we're doing. So there's got to be a constant back and forth between our insular, in-jokey, avant-garde weirdness and real people coming and seeing it and reacting or not. We came up in a sort of downtown New York community, and working in, some very small theaters, and for, a very small community really at first. So there's a lot of cross-pollination among younger companies there. And so there are a lot of opportunities. It's harder as we get older and our shows get bigger to do that. But we like to go out of town to work on things. We go try to find somebody who'll host a residency or a workshop. We're always looking for ways to get exposed to different audiences.
Can I make a quick comment? Just thank you, John, so much for today. I was just thinking while you were talking, particularly early on when you were saying how much you delight in taking on projects that seem on the face of it impossible, or in this case, a text that seems like it's just too much to digest. And I was reminded of Rex Cramphorn, after whom the lecture series is named, and there's quite a few people in the room who knew Rex well and worked with him. And he was a very extraordinary director because he's well known as one of the early experimental artists in this country. As Ian Maxwell tells the story, he had the kind of photocopy of Grotowski, that someone had brought back on a plane. This is way before the internet, and he's shoves it in the face of his colleagues and says, "This is what we're going to work to," and they made extraordinary non-text based work. But he also loved staging Shakespeare and French neoclassical tragedies. And I had the privilege of being with Rex, not that long before he died, in a classroom, a French theatre course on theatre translation. And he brought to the class a text and he said, "This is the play that I would love to be able to stage. I haven't worked out a way to do it yet." And so I'm just giving this to you. You could take this away, you see. And it's by Jean Rotrou, and it's called Le Véritable Saint-Genet, the True Saint Genesius. And it's a play where a bunch of actors turn up to perform in front of Nero and to entertain Nero. It's a play about the martyrdom of Saint Genesius, this idiot who turned Christian. So they're going to show the play and Nero's going to laugh about watching this Christian get martyred. And the lead actor, a little bit like Jesus of Montreal, Lepage's thing, the lead actor gets subsumed by the role and fully overcomes. And then his fellow actors in rehearsal saying, "What the fuck are you doing?" Like he's totally into it. And I just think Rex would have loved what you're talking about here, the way these office workers sort of start getting into the text, and the fellow office workers are all skeptical, and then they all start becoming the characters. I think Rex would have loved it. And yeah, I could ask a question about the presence of the narrator, but I think I'll just leave it with that
It's
thought.
great to learn about him, actually. I would love to know more. And it's maybe, not a coincidence that he was lost the same year we started. Maybe we inherited a little bit of that spirit in 1991 when we first came together.
Yeah, well, fairy dust, it's meant to fly around. Yeah.
I think we might close it there. We have refreshments outside, which we invite you to imbibe. And just a final thank you to John. So pleased you
Thank
could
you very much.
come by Sydney.